Our first speaker is Sophie Walsh, first-year English PhD student at the Universities of Exeter and Southampton, and the recipient of an AHRC Collaborative Doctoral Award, working with the Dorset County Museum and Dorset History Centre. Her project is on Hardy, Dorset and the wider world, with a specific focus on the space and place of Hardy's Wessex. And here is her paper, Constructing a Modern Wessex, a Paradox of Progress and Preservation. Sophie.
When Hardy introduces Wessex in Far from the Madding Crowd in 1874, it is little more than a background setting to his novel. By the time Hardy has finished his career as a novelist, Wessex has been developed into a globally recognisable inter- and extra-textual geography on which Hardy reflects in the preface to Far from the Madding Crowd in 1895. This paper will examine various instances of Wessex's topographical development roughly between the initial publication of Far from the Madding Crowd to the revised edition, with a particular focus on the context of mapping into which Hardy enters, and argue that Hardy establishes a paradox between preservation and progress, looking back in order to look forward through the deliberate construction of Wessex. Firstly, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Dorset History Centre for the reproductions I've used in this PowerPoint. So, as I say, Thomas Hardy first introduces Wessex to his fiction in chapter 50 of Far from the Madding Crowd. Although striking in its resurrection of a name of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, it appears here as little more than as a background to Hardy's realist or pastoral text. However, even at this early stage of Hardy's writing career, he places into this Wessex landscape a prototype of the end-of-the-century new woman, even having her possess land within that landscape, thereby pushing the old and new together and embedding that paradox of progress and preservation into the very topography of a fictional space. In revising Far from the Madding Crowd for the Osgood McIlvain's Wessex Novels series, the most considerable and noticeable changes Hardy makes to the manuscript are to the construction of Wessex. He creates a more unified fictional topography with consistent place names and distances, coordinating the geography to be consistent with the rest of the novels in the series, as well as with the real landscape of southwest England. But by this point, towards the end of the 19th century, a lot of work has already taken place outside of the text, which has enabled the paradox of past and progress to emerge from the Wessex space. Wessex has been mapped, first in the Bookman in 1891, and then it is in the Wessex Novels edition of 1895 that the first authorised map of Wessex appears. But Hardy has also moved outside of his own constructed maps of Wessex to chart a character's journey through that fictional space. Crutchley's railway and telegraphic map of Dorset is undated, although my research suggests it was produced in 1865. It depicts the Dorset of Hardy's 20s, and as the title suggests, likewise shows that the county and wider region is not a detached, remote, or backwards periphery, but a connected modern space. This copy is part of the Dorset County Museum's Thomas Hardy archive, and what I want to show you here is the red map, the red line which Hardy has drawn on it to show Tess's route. And obviously, you can't see that on this because it's a very old pencil drawing, so I've had to digitally manipulate the image. By taking out the yellow and bringing forward the red, so you might be able to see it a bit better now. Is that a bit better? Yeah. Through this act of drawing a fictitious journey on a map, the original Crutchley map becomes part of Hardy's biography and further connects the landscape with the characters who interact with those spaces. Crucially, it creates a bond between Hardy's Wessex and the real modern landscape of southwest Britain. Hardy does not choose an ancient map on which to impose his literary vision, but a railway and telegraphic map showing all the railways and names of stations, also the telegraphic lines and stations. It is a map depicting a space which is arterially connected to the modern corpus of Great Britain by new technology. However, this map is also a palimpsest, under which Hardy reveals what has been lost from this landscape. Kester Rattenbury has noted that Tess's map of Wessex is precisely a walk from one vanished settlement to another through a landscape of epic depopulation. Hardy states in the 1912 General Preface to the Macmillan Wessex edition, that he attended across his novels to preserve for his own satisfaction a fairly true record of a vanishing life. Similarly, in the 1895 preface to Far from the Madding Crowd, Hardy reflects on what has already been lost from the landscape he here calls a modern Wessex. He notes that at the time the novel was originally written, the village on which Weatherbury is based could be recognisable, but that just 20 years later it would hardly be discernible to the explorer in an existing place nowadays. Whether that's true or not is up for debate, of course, but Hardy certainly believed that. One piece of good fortune, as Tony mentioned, is that the old church remains, but less than 2 decades will pass before Hardy adds to the 1912 preface that this is no longer the case. Architecturally, the landscape of the real southwest has changed then, but so has people's attitudes towards that space. There has been a break of continuity in local history, more fatal than any other thing to the preservation of folklore, close intersocial relations, and eccentric individualities. Hardy therefore includes in the novel several examples of extinct practices as an attempt to preserve them. Crucially, they have been lost as a result of the separation of people from the very soil of a place. Underline there, the attachment to the soil. And Hardy therefore plants the seed of the paradox of progress and preservation into the constitutive element of that landscape, into the soil. Because Hardy is equally interested in the advancements which have improved the lives of the people who live within that landscape. I don't believe that he's saying that everything on the right hand of the slide is necessarily a bad thing because it has replaced folk traditions. The present life of the Dorset labourer, quote, is almost without exception one of comfort, Hardy writes to H. Rider Haggard in 1902. Hardy is paradoxically interested in preserving what has been lost and enabling the progress of workers' lives, and refuses to place one above the other in this preface to Far from the Madding Crowd. But why Wessex? Why turn to an ancient place for a novel set and written in the 19th century? Now, Lionel Johnson offered this explanation in The Art of Thomas Hardy. Wessex is full of significance, and no outworn appellation of antiquity without a living force. In calling the land of his birth and of his art after its ancient name, the land of the West Saxons, Mr. Hardy would have us feel the sentiment of historical continuity from this old time to ours. The idea of historical continuity is important. Wessex connects past and present, according to Johnson, and writing this in the 1890s, a decade in which people are looking forward to a new century, Wessex also has a place in the future. And indeed, Hardy continued to develop the fictional geography of his poems and novel revisions well into the next century. Even after his death, Wessex is continually reimagined and reconstructed, as I'll demonstrate in just a moment. Another reason for introducing Wessex in Far from the Madding Crowd is that it creates a fictional space in which people are able to cross boundaries. He repeatedly stresses in his letters that Wessex applies to a whole region, not just the county of Dorset, and therefore it's unlimited by county boundaries, as you can see from the quotes on the left-hand side. Hardy's Wessex is all about crossing and dissolving borders, enabling human connections to emerge across regional and global spaces. This kind of freedom of movement is necessary for progression, as these arbitrary borders are often violent and necessarily prevent progression. As Hardy writes in 1917, nothing effectual will be accomplished in the cause of peace till the sentiment of patriotism be freed from the narrow meaning attaching to it in the past and be extended to the whole globe. By looking backward to a time of unified identity, Hardy is able to look forward to a global landscape in which people are proud patriots of the world, free of the arbitrary borders of nation-states. However, this idea has often been, perhaps deliberately, misunderstood. Hardy is here on the left responding to readers who mistake Wessex just for Dorset. And this 1964 map of Wessex is a further example of this restrictiveness being placed upon Hardy's landscape. This map was produced for Longman's Booksellers of Dorchester. It's an Ordnance Survey-style map with Hardy's fictitious place names in red, using modern mapping methods to depict Wessex as a tangible modern landscape. However, although titled as a map of Wessex, it in fact only includes a subsection, from Bridport or Hardy's Port Bredy on the west, to Christchurch on the east, and Gillingham or Leadington on the north. The rationalisation between this limitation of Wessex is perhaps because it has been produced for booksellers in Dorset, and therefore most interested in that Dorset landscape. But Hardy clearly conceived of Wessex as including much more than Dorset, as he repeatedly established in his letters and in his prefaces. It's here. In particular, I want to argue that by adopting the stylistic features of the Ordnance Survey, this map is further attempting to establish a misplaced boundary onto the space of Wessex. The Ordnance Survey County Series of 1841 to 1888 was born from a necessity to accurately and systematically establish boundaries between places, both as a way of recording populations and administrating them. At its inception, the Ordnance Survey had not really paid much attention to county boundaries, and historically, other maps' portrayal of borders had not been consistent, as they were generally for different purposes, such as estate, enclosure, or tithe maps. As one historical geographer has observed, frequently knowledge of boundaries existed only in local memory, reinforced by ceremonial processions or perambulations around the bounds. Regional identities were not bounded by counties, and one could travel freely to claim poor relief, for example. However, the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which establishes the union workhouses that Fanny enters, centralised poor relief from the form of workhouses to be administrated by local authorities, and they required the definitive recording of administrative boundaries. The 1841 Ordnance Survey Act enabled those local knowledges of boundaries to become authoritative in its county series. So while undoubtedly the landscape of Great Britain changed dramatically over the course of Queen Victoria's reign, with the spread of urban places and the introduction of the railway network, the invisible lines that divided that space further altered Victorians' perception of local and national landscapes, a perception of space as being limited, divided, and restrictive. The references to the Ordnance Survey in Hardy's letters suggest that he was not entirely satisfied with their work. For example, in a response to a letter from W.G. Bowman, who proposed the establishment of a Royal Wessex Society, or a monthly magazine devoted to the so-called Wessex movement, Hardy suggested that the best place to start would be to focus on the preservation of local names, which are so muddled and neglected by the surveyors of the Ordnance map as to be disappearing fast. I suggest that by asserting Wessex onto a map of the southwest in the 1890s and disintegrating the borders so systematically established throughout his lifetime, Hardy has also opposed the Ordnance Survey's reinforcement of arbitrary boundaries by instead turning to an older form of mapping. John Ogilby was a pioneer of strip maps which depicted a journey along the major post roads in England and Wales. Published in 1675, these were the first maps to specifically portray roads from London to and across counties. These are some of the earliest maps held in the Dorset History Centre. Rather than presenting the layout of an area, these maps cut up the landscape and are designed to look like an unravelled scroll, as you can hopefully see. They show only the route required, and this one depicts the route roughly. I travelled yesterday from Exeter to Dorchester, so you move from Exeter down at the bottom, up and down, but it's obviously going west to east. So rather than offering a neutral overview of a landscape, these strip maps present a fixed direction and journey with no possibility for flexibility or deviation. However, unlike other maps of the time and the Ordnance Survey county series, they are not limited by county boundaries. As you can actually see from this map, the points where the road from London to Weymouth cross over the county boundaries are barely discernible, as indeed they generally are in real life. These counties become linked by this style of mapping because the road itself is not limited or restrained by the boundaries either, reflecting a landscape which is truer to life than other forms of maps. I suggest that this style of early cartography also helped people to think in terms of mobility rather than boundedness. Hardy engages with this style of mapping in his fictional vision of this landscape, such as in the poem My Sicily, or at least here presents a similar idea of Wessex as one gets of a landscape through those strip maps I just showed. In this poem, Hardy dissects the landscape in the same way as Ogilby, highlighting sites along the journey and thereby blurring boundaries between regions from the perspective of a passenger on the road from London to Exeter. These individual fragments are all connected by this journey and unbounded, in some cases, even by the stanzas of the poem. For example, in the 7th stanza, the narrator passes the house of Long Sieging, which is Basing House near Basingstoke in Hampshire, then near the thin steeple of Salisbury Cathedral in Wiltshire. Places over 40 miles apart are neared in this poem. The perspective of the observer from the road serves to cross boundaries and diminish distances, providing the reader with an impression that this landscape is one which is unbounded by arbitrary borders. Hardy also pushes periods of history up against each other in this poem and shows that the supposedly far Exonbury is connected to the modernity of the frenzy-led factions of the city by an ancient highway. Wessex is therefore at once a distant space, far Exonbury, and a space with a long history of connectivity, the ancient highway. However, characteristically, Hardy does not only look backwards to the practices of historic maps in the construction of his fictional spaces. In another poem, The Place on the Map, Hardy engages with highly innovative and modern mapping methods. Bartholomew's contour maps, published from around 1902 to 1924, were pioneering in their accurate depiction of geography by introducing a type of topographic realism which was readily readable by presenting low-lying areas by shades of green, higher ground by browns, and purples for mountains or ridges. Hardy's poem is dependent on this new form of mapping because it is the map's accuracy which sparks a characteristic melancholy memory. I mark adjusting height, coloured purple. Oh, it's cut off a bit, but the map revives her words, the spots, the time. Elsewhere in Hardy's poetry, such as in this quote from Alike and Unlike, mountains are also perceived as purple in real life, as well as on the map, further producing a connection between the physical landscapes Hardy specifically observed and the maps which depict them. Hardy therefore engages with both historic and modern forms of mapping as a reference point for the fictional Wessex landscape first introduced in Far From the Madding Crowd. In searching for a realist form of landscape representation, and by mapping a fictional geography which reproduces the real observable world, accurate and unbounded by invisible borders, Hardy is paradoxically both preserving historical conceptions of landscape and pushing forward realist observations of space far beyond the text of the novel. Wessex fundamentally allows Hardy to reimagine and preserve a lost past in order to reimagine a progressive future. From its introduction in Far From the Madding Crowd, Hardy establishes a stage on which to dramatise his fundamental paradox of progress and preservation. And from its introduction here, it has developed from the mere background of a text to become the very forefront of this paradoxical dialogue throughout and beyond Hardy's fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.